Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar, Taxpayers Protection Alliance webinar. It's entitled The Insider's View, how the FCTC was born and where is it's headed. And our guest today is Derek Yak. Now, for those of you who don't know who Derek Yak is, because he's a very well-known name in the tobacco and nicotine policy area, he's a global health expert focused on addressing major chronic diseases, mental health, and their underlying risks. He has led major initiatives to address tobacco use, healthy diets, and mental health at the World Health Organization, Yale, PepsiCo, the Vitality Group, and most recently as president and founder of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. Derek has published over 250 peer-reviewed publications and has served on several health advisory boards and is currently a member of APCO's International Advisory Board. He lives in Connecticut, USA, and is an avid swimmer. So welcome, Derek.
Morning, nice to be with you.
Yeah. The swimming, I just said you were saying it beforehand, people should go swimming in the lake in Geneva. That sounds too energetic for me, but good luck to you for doing that. So, um, Right, we'll start. We'll crack on because I know talking to fellow advocates, they've wanted to hear your stories about the start of the WHO's Framework Convention on Tobacco and Control Treaty. Now, researching this recently for a paper I did, there had been a lot of talk of the treaty for many years, going back to even the late 70s, I think, which surprised me. But it wasn't until the election of former Norwegian government minister Gro Harlem Brundtland, when she was elected Director General of the WHO in 1998, that it gave it a kick start. And she created funds for a new project entitled the Tobacco Free Initiative, which was under your leadership, Derek, in your then role as a South African public health expert and also an early advocate for international collaboration to tackle tobacco use. So, could you just tell us about how that came about, the early years of the FCTC, and the formation, and what your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, thanks, and it's good to reflect. Actually, going back a little bit before that, the first time there was a public statement about the need for what was then called an international framework for tobacco control was actually in Harare, Zimbabwe, in a meeting I co-chaired with the Minister of Health in 1993. Ruth Roma, who unfortunately has died since, actually wrote the book on global public health law with a focus on tobacco and laid out the argument for why the world of treaties that have been used in the environmental sphere were needed to address the transnational aspects of tobacco. Um, that got picked up before Brundtland came in by the Canadian government. And in fact, a number of resolutions were already drafted before Dr. Brundtland took over, calling for work on this. So I was then asked by Dr. Brundtland to make the development of the treaty the centerpiece of how we were going to advance tobacco. And there were two reasons. First of all, the numbers. Sir Richard Peto and Judith Mackay had provided the data on the huge number of deaths and disease that tobacco caused. At that time, it was about 4 to 5 million a year. Today, as you know, it's 8 to 9 million. And that this was going to be the preeminent issue to address non-communicable diseases worldwide. Secondly, she knew that to take something as complex as tobacco, it wasn't going to be good enough to have the ministers of health. You needed to have the head of state. And her experience as the Norwegian prime minister was that in driving the environmental treaties, that was the best way forward, to use UN treaty law. So it was armed with the size of the problem, the fact that there was fair neglect of it, and that a mechanism to raise the public profile was the treaty that then got us to put in place the machinery, which meant eventually, within a few months of starting, we were employing more lawyers and international lawyers in the Framework Convention little team than in the whole of WHO combined, which gives you a sense of the complexity that it took.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I've heard that statistic before, I think, about the number of lawyers involved in this project. Now, you are known for having a few reservations about this treaty since. I mean, writing in The Lancet as far back as 2014, you expressed concerns that you observed that it was getting ideological, introverted, not moving with the times, and you recalled that Harlem Brundtland had recognised the need for collaborative stakeholder input in the early years, and she declared that. And this is quote, despite our concerns about these clear differences in position, we are committed to hearing how the tobacco companies do propose to reduce the harm that their products cause. We have invited tobacco company scientists to provide their views on product modification to this committee. So, what was the tone of that article? And because we're seeing now your concerns are being made very real by the treaty. But you said that over 10 years ago.
Yes, I think we recognize as we were developing the treaty that we needed to have the voice of tobacco industry scientists to understand what they were doing in their laboratories, particularly in relation to harm reduction, which was always part of the definition of the treaty. We also recognize that if you both learned from the rest of the treaty world in the UN, progress happened when you have public, private, non-profit, those involved in willing to debate in public fora and not be restricted. Unfortunately, a lot of that got closed down by the treaty process. Again, we also envisioned that the success of the treaty would require significant finance to low middle income countries to develop their research capacity so that they wouldn't be dependent upon US or European stuff being imported into their country to tell them what they should and shouldn't do. Unfortunately, none of that funding happened. There were many other elements of the treaty that just never played out, including one of the ones now that's a great concern for farmers, the need to strengthen the capacity of farmers as demand reduced. But the biggest concerns was the total neglect of harm reduction, the total neglect of innovation in science, that on the one hand was happening rapidly inside industry, but was being neglected by the WHO. It continues to be neglected, and the complete absence of bringing in funding beyond one particular philanthropist, Bloomberg. So your sound's gone.
So yeah, just want to answer one question that's come in the chat. This is being recorded and the video will be available on YouTube after, so you will be able to watch it back. Yeah, on that same subject, again in the Lancet, Professor Robert Beaglehole wrote in 2022 that the FCTC is no longer fit for purpose, especially for low-income countries. Neither the WHO nor the FCTC are grounded in the latest evidence on the role of innovative nicotine delivery devices in assisting the transition from cigarettes to much less harmful products. So what are your thoughts on Robert Beaglehole's opinion there?
Well, I admire him enormously as a great intellect in the field. I wouldn't write the whole thing off. I think there are elements within the Framework Convention that remain absolutely valid and needed. For example, the principle of increasing excise tax above inflation, the principle of complete bans of tobacco products, and many of the other elements that are in there. I'd rather say that what we need to strengthen is the role of harm reduction and make sure that the regulatory concepts are very different, that we regulate proportionate to the risk. So while you might tax tobacco products at a unit of, say, 100, if you're going to tax e-cigarettes and the range of harm reduction products, it should be at 100 to 1, at the 1 level. In terms of messaging, the messaging about harms needs to be fully on the combustible, but we need to be very cautious about what we say about vapes, given that they are now the commonest way that people are used to quit completely. That needs to be part of the advocacy. So I would say one needs to keep what is working, but one needs to add with greater gusto and with much more emphasis the enormous power of harm reduction to reach particularly adults who are smoking today. Because if you did that, we know that we would save 100 million lives over the next few decades.
Yeah, I just want to add, obviously, Professor Robert Beagle is a former WHO director, so him saying that was quite a powerful statement. Um, yeah, I agree with you on this treaty. I mean, the treaty, as I say to many advocates, is so many people say that perhaps we should rip up the treaty, but the treaty as it's written is not the problem, is it? It's the administration of that treaty.
It's the administration, the interpretation of certain clauses. For example, there's a famous clause 5.3, which is being interpreted as prohibit, ban, and stop any engagement with anybody associated with the industry. Whereas if you actually read the text of it, it's a fairly common sense approach to dealing with conflicts of interest. You need to be aware and open to the fact that industry can and will try and interfere, and you need to put in processes to manage that. Don't exclude, ban them and anybody who associates with them. That simply is going far too far, and it's robbing the public health scientists of the high quality research that industry can and is bringing to the table to actually end smoking.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that. I was just looking at it the other day. Bloomberg funded, I think it's the Centre for Global Governance in Good Governance in Tobacco Control. They put up an industry interference index, and they've included some consumer groups. And simply, it seems to me that anyone who disagrees with them is considered industry influence these days, which is a gross misapplication of Article 5.3, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm. Um, Now, I want to just ask something because you went to Warsaw this year, and I was in the audience when you had a panel about the 20th anniversary of the FCTC treaty. And you said that there's a statement WHO uses. It says there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the tobacco industry interests and public health policy interests. And you remarked that this isn't really relevant anymore because we have the FDA authorizing industry produced products as appropriate for the protection of public health. So could you just expand on that and let us know what you meant by that?
Yeah, I mean, if you think back to the late 1990s, industry didn't have much on the table in terms of harm reduction. They were still selling 100% of their sales were combustible or toxic oral tobacco products. Today, we have 140, 150 million consumers around the world who are using a range of products, be it heated tobacco, vapes, nicotine pouches, snus. We have many companies starting to get 50% of their revenue from countries from reduced risk products. Billions of dollars have been invested in research. This is a different world today than what we had 20 years ago. And to say that there's an irreconcilable difference no longer makes sense, given that there are real interests on trying to move people towards reduced risk products. Think about if we said the same about the oil and gas industry or the motor vehicle industry. 20 years ago, the same seemed to be true. There were gas guzzling, pollution producing motor vehicles on the car. Now we have many of the motor vehicle manufacturers starting to produce electric cars and starting to gain their revenue. At this point, you wouldn't say there's an irreconcilable difference between them and the interests of the environment when it comes to electric cars. There's a huge common interest. And we need to live with the fact that while we still have to wash out and get rid of all the combustible cigarettes, which is certainly a goal I hope we will keep working on, we need to be encouraging even a faster movement out of those into the reduced risk products to actually focus on the public health interest. And that's the spirit of the FDA statement, a very powerful line, appropriate for the protection of public health. That means that when they authorize a pouch, some snus, a heated tobacco product, a vape, and put that label behind it, they have judged the evidence and balanced whether the overall interests of improving adult health are going to outweigh some of the concerns that many people may have. And they've judged that they do. Well, if it's good for America to say it's appropriate for the protection of public health, it must be good for every country. And my real hope is that people would look at why does the FDA make these statements and which products have already made it through. Far too few, of course, but still we've got products in every single one of the categories meeting this criteria of appropriate for the protection of public health.
Yeah, I would also argue that maybe that might have been not relevant maybe earlier. I mean, Kurt Enzel, for example, at Swedish Match, when he invented the snus portion, which it obviously increased the use of snus over and above smoking. So again, that was something that was appropriate for the protection of public health in the 1970s. You know,
Yeah, no, and I must say, mea culpa. Many of us at WHO can remember well the great Lars Ramsden, who did all the research going back into the 70s on snus in Sweden with the Swedish cancer societies, and would come to WHO and show us this data about the low cancer rates in Sweden, the general improvement, and say, well, why don't you, WHO, embrace snus in the Framework Convention? And our response was basically, well, this seems to be an industry ploy. We can't possibly go down that route. And of course, he has been completely right about it when you look at the data.
yeah, yeah, and there's still a lot of misinformation about snus going around that I see regularly in comment sections. People who seem to take it on and they conflate it with say chewing tobacco in America or something like that,
Or
which
those
is
terrible, deadly ones out in South Asia, which really give you huge oral cancers.
yeah, exactly, yeah, yeah. On the FCTC, you were part of a panel of 15 international experts who I think it was last year analysed the global progress report released by the WHO ahead of the 10th uh, Conference of the Parties, COP10, and you declared it an abject failure. Do you want to just explain that, how you came to those conclusions?
Well, we always felt that the most powerful interventions to reduce consumption or to address the needs of smokers really weren't polar opposites of the side. So the one is increasing excise tax above inflation. Well, that was not making much progress in many countries. And despite that, they seem to now be jumping into thinking, well, we're going to actually make more progress by calling for a 50% increase in tax or to just drive illicit trade through the roof. So one of the most powerful interventions has not made progress. And smoking cessation, which you'd think would be a classical thing inside the medical profession to make sure the primary healthcare clinics in low middle income countries know about whether at least NRTs and other products, that also was shown to be an extraordinary failure. The only area where you'd seen substantive progress was in terms of sticking warnings on packs. And frankly, warnings on packs don't really influence behavior significantly. My concern also was that the language is always that they list how many countries are, in their words, covered by legislation or regulation. I have no idea what cover means. It's like sticking an umbrella on top of you, but with holes that. My interest is how many individuals, how many smokers are being reached to actually give them support to quit or reduce their risks. How many governments are being given pragmatic support to make sure that they adjust their tax policy given to the reality of what the customs and excise can take in the country. That doesn't come through in the report, and that is unfortunately not the way we've seen the Framework Convention play out. I used to say that it was very easy sitting in Geneva writing law in the books, not worrying about whether it ever got translated into the streets. And that becomes the reality. The moment you walk into the holy-burly townships of South Africa or the peripheral areas of Delhi or some of the sprawling big cities of the world, and you look at, well, how are the bans working? How's access to cessation working? What are the products that actually help people reduce the risk? It doesn't exist. And the final point is that remember that the Framework Convention objective is not just to lower the smoking rate, it's actually to reduce the death and disease that it causes as well. So the question is, what has WHO through the Framework Convention done to provide better access to lung cancer treatment, to COPD treatment, to tuberculosis treatment, and to ensure that the smokers who have those conditions are given the support needed? The answer is zero. There's no report on progress at all, nothing.
Yeah, I've made that point a few times, saying that as an international treaty, it differs from other international treaties in the fact that yes, it does get buy-in from lots of different countries, and it will produce guidance of what parties can do, but it doesn't actually measure the outcomes and if these things are working, which all the
Exactly.
other international treaties do.
Yeah.
Yeah. On that point, you mentioned also about prevalence. There was something a study came out recently that what the WHO doesn't seem to do. It does focus on reducing tobacco use, but it doesn't really do much about reducing toxicity of products. And I think this is tied into the fact that it ignores harm reduction as an approach. So they're saying we need to stop people smoking, but you're not stopping people smoking to keep up with the increase in population size. So maybe they should look at reducing the toxicity of nicotine use rather than just looking at reducing smoking per se.
There are many problems on the surveillance problem, which have been made substantially worse by the events of the last couple of months when the US has withdrawn support through CDC for their surveillance that they provided to the Framework Convention. So as far as I know, there is no resourcing and support to even do the modicum of surveillance they're doing. But I think
Mm.
conceptually, the way the data is reported is pretty misleading to constantly tell us that we're seeing progress when you've got smoking rates among men in Indonesia in excess of 60%, in China in excess of 50%. In many parts of the world, the smoking rates, say in men, are 40% plus. That is not a success. That's what the smoking rates were in Europe 60 years ago. 60 years ago. You've got to
Mm.
keep that context right. When we look at women, the story is a bit more mixed. Many parts of the world, because of the resilience of women and many cultural reasons, smoking rates actually have not moved much beyond 2, 3, 4, 5%. But in parts of Eastern Europe and Latin America, women are smoking more than men today. And again, the alarms haven't been sounded. The effort to try and get harm reduction in place hasn't been done. I also think that one of the questions I've been asking my WHO colleagues to look into and to give me data on is what proportion of adult smokers smoke 20 a day and have been doing so for 20 to 30 years. The reason that group of heavier, older smokers is so important is because they account for 70% of the deaths from COPD and lung cancer, but they also account for 70% of all the cigarettes smoked among adults worldwide. You'd think that there'd be a greater focus on those who have most to benefit, and the only way to reach them is going to be through tobacco harm reduction. They haven't shown any movement on nicotine replacement therapy, yet we have great studies coming out of Australia by colleagues like Colin Wolfenson and many others showing that you can reach this hard to reach group of people with high levels of depression, heavy smokers over the age of 40 by using vapes. And I'm pretty sure nicotine pouches would do the same. That's the place that we need to go if we want to bring the rates down fast.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, I'm going to mention some of the panels we've got because, as people may know, the Taxpayers Protection Alliance is going to Geneva. We're going to be holding our Good Cop Conference 2.0. We had a Good Cop conference in Panama for the last meeting, COP10, and we're going to be doing the same in Geneva. And we have got some of the panels. I know you can't join us, unfortunately, Derek, but we have got some panels which I wouldn't mind hearing your opinion on. So we have one on the image of public health. Now, I went to Athens earlier this month. I did a panel with David Sweena from Canada, and we spoke about, is this misinformation coming from health authorities? Is it harming their credibility? So we have a panel where we're going to say it's widely recognised that WHO has failed in its treatment of the COVID pandemic, and it's clear that those handling this FCTC treaty are not acting according to science and evidence. So do these actions pose a danger to the public's trust in public health institutions?
Yeah, I think we're in a terribly complicated time. I sit in a number of meetings unrelated to tobacco harm reduction, looking at the rising level of distrust in public health and public health agencies. And there are many reasons for it. In the US, we have this massive distrust of vaccines being driven by the Secretary of Health. In the UK, or in Europe, we have the Commissioner of Health himself saying that there's no difference between the toxicity of a tobacco product and a vape or harm reduction product. Both drive disinformation, both lead to an erosion in the trust of the institutions who are putting those messages out. And the only way we're ever going to address this is if the public health, academic, NGO, and consumer groups are able to start having a greater voice and say to the table, but it'll have to be based on the science. So yes, are we in this period of deep distrust, which means from a macro point of view, we have another COVID-type pandemic? I suspect the outcome will not be as relatively good it was for COVID, given that we did get a vaccine out. The vaccine is effective, and eventually the pandemic started waning. It's not gone completely. But if we have something like that and you have rising levels of distrust, who knows what will happen? Secondly, what makes a lot of this time so treacherous is that I look more broadly at where are we seeing gains in public health that we never thought would happen. Just to mention three that I see as top of my pops of being an NCD person. First, vaccines and vaccine technology and innovation is set to increase, not decrease, which means that we'll probably be able to save substantially more lives. Today, about 3 million people are saved every year because of vaccines. Second, GLP-1 agonists are starting to come onto the market as being probably the key to addressing obesity, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, and much more. And thirdly, we have tobacco harm reduction with all of its enormous impacts. All of them we should see as for what they are. They are technological innovations based on decades of science. They have major impacts on public health. And they turn around the old argument that all we need to do is to tax everything, regulate everything, market everything, as opposed to reach the people where it matters. That's what we learned from HIV/AIDS. You stop the stigma, you actually kill the epidemic when you actually have treatment for people to take. And it was because of the power of nothing for us without us, of the AIDS patients, that we landed up having a policy that is saving so many millions of lives. The same could be true for tobacco harm reduction, for obesity, for vaccines. But those agencies are heading into a period of considerable distrust.
Yeah, I've seen it on social media. After COVID, some of the comments you get every time the WHO posts something on social media, they just get inundated with comments about COVID and everything. So I think there's already a distrust in many people with WHO, and I think it's only going to get worse if they keep saying some of the things they've been saying about harm reduction products.
Yes, and I think that, as you head into COP11, one needs to think, sort of take the long view that the current administration, Dr. Tedros and his team, are into the last year and a bit of their term. And a new Director General election will be happening over the next 14 months. To my mind, a lot of effort now needs to be put by the advocates and some of the governments who actually see the benefit into asking the question, who would be the best candidate to restore the trust of WHO, to address the science-based way of ending smoking and many of the other issues, and make sure that the candidate selection process focuses on asking candidates that particular question, and doesn't try at this late stage to influence this current administration, because it's not going to have the slightest impact.
Yeah, I think you're right. At COP10 in Panama, I think more of the agenda was devoted to discussing new and emerging products than it was to actual reducing harm from combustible cigarettes. And I think that's going to be the same at COP11. Reading the agenda, it looks the same thing again.
Yeah, and I mean, the fundamental thing that they should be trying to do is to raise finance for low middle income countries to even have a basic surveillance system, a basic tobacco control program, a basic customs and excise measure to stop the illicit trade. These very basic things need to be high on the table. And instead, as you know, they've put out a list of fanciful new ideas and plans for what should be discussed.
Yeah, forward-looking measures. We're going to be doing a panel on that as well because that is fast becoming the story. It seems to be of COP11. This idea that they're going to change an article which was just saying you can do what you like into one that's saying you should do all of these different things as well, or make it an obligation. So we will have a panel on that in Good Cop as well. Um,
Right.
but let's raise the issue of because the public health authorities always do like to talk about vaping and those products, specifically the fact that youth are using them. They like to restrict it just to talk about youth, even though there's probably about 20 times more adults who are using these products than youth. And Kenneth Warner, of course, he wrote an article, I think it was last year in the American Journal of Public Health, where it was called "Kids No Longer Smoke Cigarettes. Why aren't we celebrating?" So the question is going to be asked at that panel, why is it that institutions which claim to want an end to smoking oppose practical solutions which can work? I mean, can you explain why they do that?
No, I wish I could. I mean, I think that the youth smoking fears are just about over for the UK and for the US. And I think sensible measures, age gating and so on, is accepted as the way forward. We obviously don't want kids to smoke. We don't want them to vape, but we also don't want them to do a range of other dangerous things with psychoactive substances, which we tend not to focus on. I think it's a rather big distraction. And unfortunately, it was driven by that very early experience a few years ago when Juul went and oversold their marketing efforts to reach kids. And you did have a spiraling, massive increase in youth access to particularly Juul and Juul-related products. That's gone. And the concern that vapes or any other products are a gateway to cigarettes or something even worse has been disproved over and over again. There was never any evidence, for example, that heated tobacco products used by kids, which they don't use, would go on to cigarettes. There was just no evidence. There may be a risk on nicotine pouches that kids will like them and take them up at high levels because they look, and some are still being sold like candy, and that's just high levels of irresponsibility by the folk making them. But I don't think that the fears of massive amount of youth access should drive policy. What should drive policy is the fact that, as I said, the vast majority in deaths over the next few decades are in the adult smokers of today, providing them with every possible support, whether it's traditional cessation, harm reduction products, counseling, whatever, is going to give us the best yield in terms of long-term benefits to health.
Yeah, yeah. I've got a question coming which I want to raise with you because it fits in with something I was going to say. Asa Salagupta from Thailand, who will be in Geneva, he's coming to our conference. He's saying, what do you think about Article 5.3 to prevent stakeholders from attending? Now, this is something we talk about a lot, is that the COP meetings are closed to consumers. I know that a number of consumers with no ties to industry have applied to sit in the public gallery this year. All of them have been rejected. And the question I'm going to ask is, we're going to have a panel on this at Good Cop as well, is WHO authorities are averse to consulting with consumers in areas of tobacco harm reduction, despite us being the most affected. And you mentioned with drugs, nothing about
Yeah.
us without us. Um, but consumers have continued to talk to lawmakers. I mean, ASA in Thailand is on a committee, I think, talking to lawmakers over there. And notably in Chile, they now have a vape law, which is probably one of the best in the world. Philippines has been good on that. And the UK in the early years, especially, maybe not at the moment, but I know consumers will listen to then. But what would you be your advice to consumers and how they can influence policymakers and get their voices heard at these debates?
Well, first, I think it's inaccurate to actually apply 5.3 to non-state partners. The 5.3, the whole treaty, only applies to those people who signed the treaty, which are member states and governments, not consumer groups, not NGOs, not academics. And yet it's being used and misinterpreted to actually extend it to ban and just anybody that the Framework Convention group dislike. So that is factually incorrect. And I hope we'd actually start seeing some better legal challenges. There've been some, but nobody's actually tried to actually bring the case. Problem is, you can't bring the case in any international setting because it's never going to happen. But you could do it from a country point of view to say your right to engage with your Ministry of Health, the right that many governments have to listen to their consumer groups, is a right enshrined in law in many parts of the world. When it comes to 5.3, it all falls apart when you start asking the question, what about the state monopolies or the governments who are investing in tobacco industry? They are all going to be at the table, all of them. The biggest one being China, of course, which accounts for 50% of all production of cigarettes in the world. Well, they own the state monopoly. Recently, the Saudi government has started investing in nicotine pouches. Does that mean that they shouldn't be at the table because they're investing in nicotine pouches? I'd hope they'd be thrilled. They should be encouraged to be at the table because they're doing the right thing. What about the Egyptians or many of the others where there are large state monopolies directly or indirectly linked to government? I think that 5.3 and the whole approach to try and exclude people is going to start crumbling. And it's crumbling for the reasons you've already said. There are many countries and governments around the world that have not opted to ban or prohibit these products. They have started regulating them. And while we may not like all aspects of the regulation, the moment you regulate, you legitimate. So once something's regulated, it's a legal product. And once you have a legal product, the consumers who use its views becomes fundamental to deciding what really makes sense from a long-term policy point of view. So I think that increasingly, the users of these products are in a very powerful position at their national level to make sure that they have a chance to even be part of a delegation. And the fact that the nonprofits who are being rejected by the Framework Convention, the list is just growing and growing and growing and don't include any effective consumer groups, is something that needs to be challenged by the countries who can challenge it.
Yeah, and I would add as well that with this pivot that WHO seems to have done, where it's changed from saying it wants to reduce harms from smoking to saying it wants to reduce harms from nicotine use, that further delegitimizes consumers. And we're now seeing industry interference being directed at vaping companies who've never made a single cigarette in their existence. You know, a lot of people I know in the UK who set up businesses are people who quit smoking using vaping and then set up business to try and help other people do the same. And yet they're now being demonized as almost part of the tobacco industry themselves. And Article 5.3 is being extended to attack them as well.
Yeah, and you wonder whether because they're trying to link to say that they should focus on ending tobacco and nicotine use, whether the next logical step is to push the pharmaceutical industry out because of their nicotine replacement therapies.
Well, yeah, it is quite a hypocritical thing, isn't it, when they say, "Oh yeah, we want to ban all non-medicinal nicotine products," as if there's any difference really between a nicotine patch and a nicotine pouch, which I find rather confusing.
Yeah, and as the Cochrane people have shown very clearly, the cessation success rate is 2 to 3 times that on a vape compared to nicotine replacement therapy, which is a medicinal or therapeutic reason for using it.
Yeah, yeah. So that's your advice to consumers. So, but also, what could industry do better or more of to accelerate progress in this area, do you think?
Well, I've been quite encouraged to see industry starting to do a lot more things collectively. So the big 3 or 4 European companies have come together under, I think it's called Tobacco Europe or Europe Tobacco, to actually counter the general argument that the main reason why we're seeing failure of the Framework Convention is due to industry interference. And they're challenging that for the first time properly. I would hope that the smaller vape and pouch companies would also be a stronger voice um, across their individual products for some of the issues around access, the quality, and committing themselves to not tolerate a lot of the kiddification of their own products that many of the smaller companies have actually practiced till now. I also think that the big tobacco companies with vape companies need to think about what role can they play in investing in research and science in low middle income countries to accelerate the movement in those countries. A lot of the progress we've seen on heated tobacco products have been in advanced industrialized countries, Japan, Korea, Greece, a number of European countries. The vapes, particularly in US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, and pouches in Northern Europe generally. Very few examples of low middle income countries showing that kind of success yet because the investment hasn't come. Pakistan is an interesting one. We're starting to see the pouch movement having a big impact, which will hit into oral cancer pretty significantly, I hope. But what about a stronger push into Indonesia, into low middle income countries where smoking rates are so high? I know that many of the business plans are being laid out over the next few years or decades to do this, but how could they accelerate that? How could they show greater faith to go into countries where we know the smoking rate, particularly among men, exceed 35, 40%, and think about what product options exist there? They probably could do it if they had that single-minded focus. They could be doing it together by actually supporting nonprofits and consumer groups to be actually doing a lot of the background work.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but we've got one more panel that I'd like to ask your opinion about that we're doing at Good Cop. And it's on reform of the WHO. Because it's obviously it's facing a dramatic shortfall in funding with America and Argentina pulling out of support. And Dr. Tedros has spoken regularly of the need for reform. So it's clear that the FCTC treaty is not working as intended, as we've discussed. So what should the WHO and the Secretariat be doing better?
Well, again, I think it's premature to even get into these debates with Tedros still sitting there. It does remind me of no, quite seriously, I joined WHO in the declining years of Dr. Nakajima, who started a whole series of reform exercises to try and stay in power and keep the people involved. But they all came to naught when Brundtland came in and brought about real reform. So I think the energy is wasted trying to actually make any demands on Tedros at this point. What rather we should be doing is thinking about what should or could WHO be doing better over the next few decades. And this is not a simple question. Unlike 30 years ago, we now have many other global health players. We have Gavi, we have the Global Fund, we have a whole lot. We have a huge investment in global health that didn't exist. Gates and many others have come on board. This is all a good thing. The question is, how do you look at WHO in the context of the broader needs of global health and say, what do they do best? My own personal view is that what they do best are boring things, global norms and standards, looking at the classification of disease, what works and what doesn't work for diseases, What it doesn't do too well is anything in the operational sphere, except when they'd run a polio campaign and so on. There are so many other organizations able to do the more operational work, the emergency care, the uh, getting out into the field, even when there are pandemics. They're far better equipped. They're far better. The mindset is different. But if we don't have an international agency who can take the full body of knowledge and evidence and say what truly works and what doesn't work, and in what settings around the world will it work best, the world will be the poorer for it. A lot of that can actually be done much more effectively now that we've got AI and AI capabilities to draw on evidence, synthesize evidence. But in the end, you're going to have expert committees who understand their own countries. That's, I say, where WHO going forward could be a major continued importance for global health and avoiding some of the other stuff. The cost of doing that, by the way, would actually be substantially less than trying to run efforts around every emergency care, every major refugee issue, every major climate change issue. Those are important, but there are other agencies better equipped to deal with them.
Yeah, yeah. I must admit, that panel, I had you down as one of the panelists for that panel, so it's nice to hear your view on that. I've got a question in the audience. Someone said, is there a fundamental misunderstanding of nicotine by the WHO? Is this one reason why they've not embraced these products? And I'll just use as evidence for that. In December 2023, the WHO issued a press release urging national governments to ban e-cigarettes or failing that to only regulate them as medicines. So is that what's causing it? Is this a misunderstanding of nicotine itself?
I think many of the WHO folk, as well as many opposing the whole field, do have a deep lack of understanding of nicotine, and it shows up in the physician surveys around the world, where almost 70% of physicians in whatever country you go to now saying that nicotine causes cancer when it absolutely does not, or that has the equivalent health risk to others. Nicotine is simply a molecule which has got both beneficial effects and is the key to actually getting people to get rid of the stuff that really kills, the smoke. And we've known this for years. We've known it since the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. It's been well documented. Mike Russell, who famously made the point that you die from the smoke, not from the nicotine, went on to invent nicotine replacement therapy. This was in the 80s. Now we have a conflation of nicotine inside a product causing additional harms. That's simply not the case. We do have complications now because we've now got analogs of nicotine coming onto the market where we're not quite sure what the impacts are going to be. There's debate around, well, is synthetic nicotine better or worse? Well, of course, synthetic nicotine is just nicotine. It just happens to be produced using green chemistry. And it's far more desirable to want to use synthetic nicotine in a vape, nicotine replacement therapy, pouch, whatever, because you don't have the contaminants associated with plant-derived nicotine. But a lot of the discourse out there has got confused. But let's just keep to the facts. Nicotine is a molecule which has positive effects on the brain, the aging brain. And long-term, my own view is that that'll be the issue that'll actually drive some of the progress once we've got rid of all the contaminants that come along with it being inside a cigarette or a cigar and so on.
I'll just ask a short question in addition to that. How do we change public perception of nicotine? Because over the years, nicotine was only available through combustible cigarettes and cigars and things like that. But now it seems to me that a lot of the public conflate nicotine with combustible cigarettes and think they're both the same. How do we change that opinion amongst the public?
Well, the good news is I don't think you have to do that too much. I think it's happening fast. As I said, 140 million consumers get it.
Wow.
Anybody who listens to the common podcasts, where there are tens of millions of people watching, Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist, neurobiologist from Stanford, gets up to 100 million people in the year watching. What is he talking about? The benefits of nicotine for the brain using very detailed understanding of the neurobiology of the brain. Peter Thiel, one of the world's experts on oncology and longevity, saying that we need to think about nicotine alongside many of the other efforts we're looking at to promote healthy long-term cognitive function. Nora Volkow from the National Institutes of Health, NIDA, heads NIDA, has been talking about the positive benefits of nicotine. So I think that the relatively small tobacco control community and those focused against nicotine are being swamped by many others who have a deeper understanding and insight and are linked to the bigger areas of science, of neurobiology, neuroscience, longevity, brain science, which is all the areas where we're going to see the growth and benefit of nicotine growing. I mean, if you are a gerontologist, somebody who deals with older people, and you're faced with Parkinson's disease daily, what you're going to do, you're going to start looking at the literature and realize that nicotine may very well be one of the cheapest, most effective ways of addressing the long-term consequences of Parkinson's. That'll start breaking through. The trials are out there, the studies are getting stronger. So my view is that, say, the small cliquey group of those around the Framework Convention may not get it, but the bigger world, it's exploding out there.
Well, that's very positive. I like that. I like that. I must admit, as someone who doesn't, I don't drink tea or coffee. It is deeply frustrating that everyone seems to think that caffeine's fine, acceptable, and in every high street in the UK you have 4 or 5 coffee shops, and yet they think that nicotine is this dreadful, awful substance that no one should ever use when they're kind of the same kind of harm profile.
Well, I mean, caffeine is the most used performance-enhancing substance on the planet. Think back to my childhood. As kids, we were told you can't have coffee; it's not going to be good for you. You should restrict it. Well, that stopped when you had the rise of these coffee shops and Starbucks and many others. Nobody talks about that anymore. There's no
Mm.
question that it's a substance that many people enjoy and like and use, which I do. Well, I think nicotine's time is yet to come, and it's going to fall into the same category, except it maybe have even more powerful evidence behind it in terms of its brain effects. And if you can actually end people using something that kills you and give them something that gives you more than just neutral, but a positive impact on their brain, isn't that rather miraculous?
It would be indeed, yeah, definitely. On that kind of subject, Julian Budoy, he's a journalist from Romania. He's asked what scientific standards and evidence thresholds should be established to qualify a reduced risk tobacco product for official recognition under the FCT treaty. Is that even possible, do you think?
I think we should use whatever the FDA does when they decide something's appropriate for the protection of public health. I don't think we have to reinvent standards and norms, and they probably being even more rigorous than one needs to. But I think the fact that they, as a regulatory body, the MSRA in the UK have got an approach. The Canadian government, many of the governments have set up ways of deciding whether this product meets the criteria of being overall beneficial for health. WHO should have a bring together those regulatory bodies who've made their decisions and decide what is the simplest, most pragmatic way to do it. Focusing particularly on what I think are some of the big goals. You don't want to do harm, so you want to focus on safety. You want to protect kids, so you've got to make sure you've got the appropriate age gating in place. And then ideally, you want to set up the mechanism to know that long term, these products actually are having the desired effect on lowering cancer, cardiovascular, and many of the other conditions.
Um, Julian's also asked another question, which I'll put to you. What is the main risk the FCT? I think this touches on what we spoke about earlier about the credibility of public health institutions. But what's the main risk the FCTC faces if it continues to resist integrating harm reduction principles into global policy, focusing solely on prohibition rather than on scientific innovation and effective measurable outcomes? So, what
Well, in
risk
a
does it
word,
face by pulling that? Sorry, yeah.
just becoming irrelevant. And I think it is fast becoming irrelevant. If many of the member states who've actually signed on to the Framework Convention are no longer actually listening to the calls to prohibit and ban, which more and more countries are going in that direction, why would they bother coming? What for added value? Look at the funding of the Framework Convention. It's likely to continue to spiral down, which makes it very difficult for them to continue doing what they're doing. Um, I think that under a new Director General, one needs to ask the question, what could it be doing? It could be the source of high quality data on what's working and what doesn't work, which should include all of these harm reduction products. There should be powerful advocates for those things that work, whether it's a pharmaceutical or a non-pharmaceutical harm reduction product. And for the rest, they should be making sure that the government is able to execute its tax policy and everything else, and then stand back because a lot of those projects, a lot of what is the beauty of harm reduction is that the companies who've got the products are out there being able to do the supply chain, do the marketing, do the outreach, do the consumer insights, do the R&D without having a cent of public money behind them. That's a huge saving to WHO at a time when the long-term financial viability of the organization is seriously being questioned.
Yeah, that is puzzling, isn't it? Where you have legislators all over the world who have this product, which is now the most popular cessation product in many countries and much more effective than NRT. And it doesn't cost them anything. You know, if people just go to a vape shop and buy a vape with their own money, you don't need to spend all the money on the smoking cessation clinics and all the rest of it. And it does seem baffling as to why governments can't seem to understand that.
Yeah.
I've got another question here. More than denying, and this is touching on Article 2.1 and the forward-looking measures that are on the agenda for COP11. More than denying harm reduction applying to tobacco, FCT Secretary is seeming to implement a de facto prohibition of combustible cigarettes by, for example, prohibiting filters. What do you think of that idea? Again, it's one of those forward-looking measures, isn't it, in Article 2.1?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one because we have not had a public discussion on whether you should take filters off or put them on. You know, if you'd asked me a year or two ago, I would have thought that's completely nuts. But I think if you look at what Mike Cummings and many others are saying, there may be some validity to the fact that the use of filters may have increased certain types of lung cancers because of different puffing behavior and so on. So I would say that the science is unclear. And if that's the case, the responsible thing for WHO to do is to have an expert committee, bring together the people who understand this. What are the concerns? Is it plastic? Is it the rise of certain types of cancers? Or is to try and just get smokers to hate their product and not take it up by taking the filter off? Whatever it is, I think is exactly the criteria that one use when you've got doubt. You don't go and put it to a COP meeting when there's no certainty. We don't really know the long-term implications. It hasn't been studied. There's nothing in the Framework Convention that wasn't first tested in many countries around the world over many decades. That's the route you need to go when you're going to make a global norm or global statement, as opposed to just choosing something off the list that sounds very fun and interesting. Let's take the filters off, which will probably get a lot of publicity, but is probably far too early to know whether it's good or bad.
Yeah, it's definitely getting publicity. I've read many articles on that already, and there's been an explosion in the last week as we get nearer to COP11. But yeah, I noticed that from the documents the WHO sent out to do with the forward-looking measures, they mentioned many times that these things are they're kind of experimental. They've never been tried before. And the bar for the evidence isn't anything that's in the real world. It's modeling on a computer and stuff like that. So they haven't really looked into a lot of those forward-looking measures very, very closely at all, have they?
No, and that's exactly my point, that those original steps that got support in the Framework Convention were done from the 1970s to the 1990s in countries like Norway, Sweden, UK, New Zealand, Canada, and so on. And they showed over the course of time what works and what doesn't work. That is the responsible way that an UN treaty process is supposed to work. You gather the evidence from countries to make sure that you're not going to mistake. The worst thing to do is to put out a recommendation into the world generally when you have not done your homework. Because can you imagine the size of the error if people actually pick it up and do it for popularist reason and turns out to be wrong? That's not the way forward.
Yeah, sure. Okay, we're coming to the last few minutes. I've got a question to ask here. As we discussed, this is the 20th anniversary of the Framework Convention. I think that was in May, wasn't it, this year? What discussions are we going to be having 20 years from now about the WHO, FCTC, and tobacco harm reduction? Will the WHO finally embrace harm reduction? Will more countries emulate Sweden and Japan and that sort of thing and become smoke free? And is there any hope basically for change at the WHO towards this subject? I think you mentioned we might need regime change first, but is there anything else that you can see in the future that might happen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always hopeful. I'm hopeful that an inspired director general will come in the way Brundtland came in 1998. Somebody who is committed to the science and calls together a group to ask the question, how do we really end smoking fast? And that the panel comes up with the kind of decisions that are being made by many companies, many advocates, many consumers. Let's put all our focus on getting harm reduction out there. If so, a decade from now, we will be able to have cut the billion smokers and users of tobacco by 50%, maybe even more. And we will already starting to see a dramatic decline in the death rate. 20 years from now, we should be down to, I don't know, 5, 10%. We should all be Sweden's by then.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, could anything happen at COP11? I mean, COP10, there was between 30 and 40 countries that objected. I think mostly on Article 9 and 10 on context of emissions, on about the way the WHO and FCTC were handling this subject, and the fact that they didn't allow them to have a working group of people to talk about that subject. So could there be more opposition to the WHO's stance at COP11?
I hope so. And again, if you look at the way so many more countries since COP10 are actually being supportive in different ways of regulating and supporting or investing in tobacco harm reduction, I certainly hope that's the case. To me, the best outcome of COP11 is the very first bioethical principle: do no harm. Let's hope they do nothing. Let's hope that at the end of it, there's a discussion around the intent to relook at the evidence, given that it's moving so fast. But there are no additional calls for prohibitions and bans and restrictions. Rather, I hope that the countries who're seeing the benefits, everything from Japan to Korea to Norway to Sweden to the UK to the US, stand up and talk about the data that they actually are seeing in terms of their consumers moving away from cigarettes into a wide range of harm reduction products. If we do that, and remember, usually one wants consensus, I think we could have a meeting that comes out at it, and this could be a turning point to say that this is the time when, as Tedros hands over to whoever's going to take over, we will see a new path forward.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed we get something like that. I mean, I'm looking forward to what's going to come out of it. I've been looking at the agenda, and some of it looks just quite outrageously mad. I have to say some of the agenda items, but we'll be there. We'll be going. The Taxpayers Protection Alliance is going. We're going to have our Good COP 2.0 meeting, and we've got 37 experts, I think, from 22 countries, and we're going to be sort of assessing the facts that are coming out of the FCTC and talking about alternatives, which I
Yeah.
think they need to embrace. But yeah, anyway, thanks very much, Derek, for giving us your time, and it's been great talking to you. And it's a shame you can't come for Geneva, but I hope you can have a watch and see some of your colleagues, I suppose, talk about harm reduction and what the WHO could be doing better. But so thanks very
Yeah.
much, and
No, no,
thanks very
I
much.
hope it's fantastic. And just make sure that you all have a chance to really save a fantastic fondue with their local wines and then go and cool off in the beautiful Lake Geneva.
Well, yeah, you're very knowledgeable about Geneva, aren't you? Yeah, that's right. I know it's an expensive city, but I went there earlier this year with David, president of TPA, and it looks a lovely city as well. So we're looking forward to that. So yeah,
Great.
so that's the end of our last
Okay.
countdown to COP11 webinar that we've been doing a series of these, and so the next stop for us at the TPA is Geneva for our Good COP 2.0 conference. So thanks everyone for watching, and goodbye.
Thank you.